I'm so very much looking forward to this match because last year, and even in the Super Cup, that was the matchup between I think the two teams that played the best football last year for sure. At times they still do this year too. Then maybe not. Neither one of them are quite at the same level that they were last year, but you can still see that potential. And and Xabi Alonso and Sebastian Hoeneß, maybe the two best coaches in German football at the moment, going against one another. Some might argue that Vincent Kompany should be part of that conversation too. I'm not quite there yet to include him in that, but it is such an intriguing start to this match day. To have this matchup kicking it off, and yeah, I personally can't wait to see it. I think just judging from what we've seen last year, this is going to be just such a brilliant match.
Yeah, it's as you said, it's a showdown that hasn't really disappointed recently. Dennis Undav himself said at the end of last season that he thought it was the two best teams in Germany. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to say that this season, but they're definitely two teams that will be challenging for the top four. If Leverkusen can kind of get their act together, it could still be challenging for the league title. And fascinatingly enough, Stuttgart, even though they are, eighth in the league table, and have had a few wobbles already this season, they still seem to have this remarkable ability to kind of raise their game for the big games against the big opponents, rather. We saw that against Real Madrid, we've seen against Juventus. It didn't really work out against Bayern Munich, but they then thumped Borussia Dortmund as well before that. So I think Leverkusen go into this game very, very wary of what Stuttgart are capable of. And actually, I saw a report today that said Sebastian Hoeneß is actually who Leverkusen would prefer as their ideal successor if Xabi Alonso was to leave. And that's obviously something that's very easy to say, behind closed doors, but it also, I think, is a huge compliment to the job that Hoeneß is doing there, that if Alonso does move on to a Bayern Munich, a Real Madrid, Manchester City, whoever else he's been linked with recently, then Hoeneß is probably the next best head coach in German football. And it's a remarkable showdown that I think will test the very best of both these clubs.
Yeah, I mean, Xabi Alonso said today, I think it was actually today that he said, we're recording this on Thursday, so putting a timestamp onto this podcast, but he said, after every game against Stuttgart, I'm just absolutely destroyed.
Yeah, I saw that.
And I mean, it's true, right? These two teams, they have been going against each other on such a high level. The Super Cup is the latest example, right? Where I thought Stuttgart finally had them. And then Patrick Schick came in late to equalize, and then Leverkusen won it in penalties, right? Statistically, it's a draw. But yeah, I think these two teams play at such an enormously high tactical level that I can understand why when they face one another, that it is very strenuous for the head coaches as well. I was not only at the Super Cup, but I also actually did manage to see both those games, the Bundesliga games. I missed the Pokal match, which was outstanding as well, right? But I saw the Stuttgart game in Leverkusen and the Leverkusen came in Stuttgart live and reported on those on location, and the football was just outstanding, right? And so I think what we are going to witness is going to be so very fascinating. And I think too, for both of these teams, it's a bit of a directional kind of situation, right? I mean, both these teams need the points. Leverkusen slipped up against Werder Bremen on last weekend, right? Both of those teams advanced in the German Cup. More difficult for Stuttgart maybe than for Leverkusen. Stuttgart rotated very heavily. I mean, we spoke midweek about how Stuttgart really are a victim of this congested schedule, because not only do they play in the Champions League, in the German Cup, in the Bundesliga, but they also are the backbone of the German national team at the moment, right? So they have all these extra UEFA Nation League games on top of that to deal with. In fact, we have 2 more UEFA Nation League games in the beginning of November, which is just wild. This season is just so congested with so many games, and so Stuttgart really made the most out of the midweek cup game and heavily rotated and still looked, I thought, really, really good. So I think we're going to see the two A teams going against each other here for this one, because they both had a little bit of a quote-unquote break midweek by playing against lower division teams, Stefan.
Yeah, I thought it was quite telling. It's almost like a compliment to both teams that both of them kind of put out as many of the kind of B team players as they could to rest ahead of this game. Asking both teams to also play midweek and then play on a Friday as well, by the way, is just absolutely crazy. I think it's something the authorities have to seriously look at, because that's just not enough time, especially for Stuttgart, who played last night, if I'm not mistaken. Unless I'm completely... I'm getting my football nights mixed up.
They both
played
played on Tuesday, yeah. But they have Champions League games next week, right?
Yeah, but I mean, to play Tuesday, then again, to play again on Friday is just insane. So we need to see what kind of performance we get out of both of them. But, to focus maybe on Leverkusen a bit more, because, I wrote my newsletter on this week, and you obviously watch the Stuttgart game, so I'll obviously you can talk more about that. But I'm really intrigued to see what we see from Leverkusen in this game, because not only do they rest players, but there's still a huge amount of question marks over this team. Xabi Alonso's side have really struggled this season, I think, because they're still depending on a lot of older players who have seen their kind of performances not so much nosedive, but maybe drop off by like 10-15%, and it's kind of reverberating throughout the entire team, really. The one that I noticed the most was Jonas Hoffmann, who was such a key player last season, has been largely overlooked by Xabi Alonso, except for these kind of cup games. He obviously came in midweek there. He's played a lot of other cup games, but Alonso's been really hesitant to play him for much of the season. He's tried to play Martin Terrier there, which hasn't really quite worked out. Nathan Tella obviously played midweek as well. Is another player who has been kind of really grasping and desperate to play, but hasn't really been getting a huge amount of game time. Another one, of course, is Granit Xhaka, who still has a lot to offer going forward, but I think he's really struggled defensively this season. I noted in my article that last season, only Palacios was the only player outside of Leverkusen's defence who finished the season with more tackles in the Bundesliga than Granit Xhaka, whereas this season, I think there's 4 or 5 players, including Adli, who's a winger, and doesn't even start every week, and he's already got picked up more tackles than Granit Xhaka. So that kind of aspect of Xhaka's game is definitely kind of lingering. And the other 2 players, of course, were Jonathan Tah and Lucas Herdesky, who both kind of put on these kind of superhuman performances last season. They played beyond what we've seen really from either of them in terms of their career. And we've seen them both kind of come back down to earth. And actually, the Herdecki stats were actually quite remarkable. Actually, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he went from being the second best shot stopper in the league last season to now 10th this time around. And he turns 35 next month, so obviously he's not going to be getting any better soon. So Leverkusen have these players throughout their team who are either very old, or not very old, getting older, or have played a huge amount of football in terms of Jonathan Tah, and might be looking a little jaded. And they're still very reliant on them one way or another, and they haven't really been putting in the huge performances for them. So this game against Stuttgart will be a huge test in a number of ways, but I'm also really looking forward to see how those players specifically do against a very energetic and a very youthful Stuttgart team.
I mean, the one thing that, and you're pointing it out kind of here, and it's really interesting, Kicker ran a comparison between Leverkusen's last season and this season, and Stuttgart's last season and this season, and actually statistically, they're pretty much the same in every category from last year to this year, so this is for both clubs. The one big difference is Leverkusen last year 0.7 goals against per 90 minutes. This year 1.9. Stuttgart last season 1.1 goals per 90 minutes against. This year 2. That's the only statistical difference for both of these teams. Other than that, they're either the same or better. The only other one that stands out for Stuttgart is that, and this is probably goes into the amount of goals that they've been conceding this year versus last year, is that they're only challenging in 88 times per 90 minutes this year rather than 97 times last year, right? And this is in 1-on-1 defensive situations. And I think that is pretty much, this is what we highlighted for both of these teams. They're just not at the same level defensively for very different reasons. You already pointed out Leverkusen I think for Stuttgart, it's really quite obvious. It's just, they lost Ito and Waldemar Anton. And, the guys that are in right now are just not at the same level. And I think it's really fascinating that what I've said and what you've said as well on Stuttgart is that, look, they are actually playing just as good football as they did last year, with one just tiny little difference, which is that the defense isn't just at the same level yet. And I'm really emphasizing the yet, because I do think that from a talent perspective, Wall, Chabot, all these guys that are playing there now are probably going to be able to reach the Ito Anton level eventually, but it takes time, right? The defensive issues are just something that is just takes a little bit longer to gel, and I think that is the one factor. The one thing that really stands out for me for Leverkusen, and I think this is maybe where the whole Jonathan Tah situation really comes in, Stefan, and maybe also Granit Xhaka as well, just 1 year older, right? At that age. And I wrote about this a little bit with Manuel Neuer this year. When athletes go beyond their peak and they hit a certain age, it really drops off fast, right? It kind of almost falls off a cliff. And with Granit Xhaka, Leverkusen still got him in his prime last year, but maybe he's not quite there yet anymore. And Jonathan Tah, I think there's a good reason why Leverkusen were quite happy to sell him on and maybe start a little bit of a rebuild in defense there, because, the writing has been maybe on the wall. And that's just a reality of life, that by not selling, Leverkusen have maybe slowed down what they thought themselves was a necessary rebuild in the back four.
Yeah, I mean, I think Leverkusen probably would have been quite happy to move Jonathan Tah on. They were probably quite happy to move Frimpong on as well, even though he's still very young. I think they're well aware of the fact that they have to continue kind of rebuilding the squad and refreshing that pool of players, or else you do get stale, you do get complacent. You can even look at players who aren't really old, but maybe been at the club for a certain period of time. Someone like Tab Soba, for example, who has had a very inconsistent start to the season. He's also been a player who's been heavily linked with moves for years now. And he's maybe thinking to himself, well, I proved myself at Leverkusen, I don't have anything else to prove. Now, you might not be saying that physically, but you might be saying it subconsciously. And that's why maybe Xabi Alonso is just finding it a little harder to get performances out of these guys. But, I think we have to wait and see what happens with Leverkusen. Like I said in the article, there's still plenty of time for them to turn things around. There's still plenty of time for them to get back on track. They're not that far behind Bayern Munich, who themselves are perfectly capable of dropping points as well. So there's still plenty to play for here. And this game is a perfect example of them being able to kind of turn around and say, look, people have maybe started to rise off, but we've still got plenty to show. And they would have looked at, Bayern Munich's 4-0 win over Stuttgart as well and thought, well, that's the level we have to match if we want to be title contenders again this season. We have to show that we can beat very difficult teams like Stuttgart at home and pick up the points as expected of us. So we'll have to wait and see what happens, but it's a huge, huge test for Leverkusen. I think Stuttgart go into it with a degree of pressure off them because they're not really expected to win this. No one's kind of talking them up. It's like top 4 contenders. They've talked as well themselves about being quite happy just to kind of finish in the top 8, hit top 9, whatever else. And as you said, they've both got Champions League games as well to bear in mind as well in start of next week. So it's all on Leverkusen. I think the pressure's all on them to prove that they are still title contenders, that these players can still kind of match the heights they set last season. And yeah, we need to see what happens.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's without a doubt the top match of the match day, and it's very early on Friday, so make sure to tune in.